Welcome to the second episode of ranking every Doctor Who story ever. Make sure to go watch the first episode for more information. Remember, this entire list is just a reflection of my opinion, and is not an attempt at an objective list. Now, let's get right into it. In 285th place, it's the first Hartnell story on the list, The Web Planet. I do admire the story's ambition, as it features no humanoid characters outside of the main cast. However, the actual plot is incredibly dull and slow-moving, and it culminates in an extremely generic and forgettable climax. Of course, by far the worst aspect of this story is that the Zarbi, which are the giant ants, make extremely irritating noises, and these noises can be heard throughout the majority of the story. The whole story has the feel of an elementary school play. In 284th place, I'm going with Orphan 55 from Series 12. This story was widely mocked for its attempt at a political statement, and yes, the devastated Earth thing has been done many times before, and the Doctor's final speech was preachy and poorly written. However, in my opinion, that stuff is not the real problem with this story. One issue I had is the design of the dregs. Had they looked more similar to humans, I think they could have been a more unnerving concept. However, with the design they used, they just looked like random throwaway monsters. The worst part of this story, though, were the supporting characters. The story features not one, but two tumultuous parent-child relationships. One of them was very forgettable. It consisted of nothing more than a child wanting to help his father, and his father saying no. The other one was just bizarre. A seemingly normal character suddenly threatened to blow up the entire resort because her mom abandoned her as a child. And by the way, this mother looked no more than 15 years older than her supposed child, whom she didn't even recognize. It feels like this plot point was added in as a last-minute rewrite just to spice up the story. However, the worst supporting character was of course Vilma, who did little more than scream, "Benny!" at the top of her lungs. It honestly feels like even the other actors were annoyed by her. Also, the fact that every single character, including a child, went in the vehicle to rescue Benny was completely needless and completely irresponsible, and it happened purely to push the plot forward. All that being said, I am beginning to like this story the more I think about it. Not because it's actually good, but because it's bad in a very entertaining way. In 283rd place, I have the first Russell T Davies era story on the list, The Idiot's Lantern. When people talk about the worst David Tennant stories, they almost always mention either Love and Monsters or Fear Her. And sure, neither of those stories are good, but I find The Idiot's Lantern to be even worse. The villain is extremely cartoonish. It's incredibly difficult to take her seriously when she yells, "Feed me!" and "Hungry!" constantly. The face removal is a potentially creepy idea, but the special effects weren't quite good enough to actually make it creepy. Also, the whole idea of telling a story about a soldier who fought against fascism becoming what he fought against could have been interesting, but it was executed as a B-plot with a bunch of one-dimensional characters. Overall, this is definitely a story I wouldn't mind forgetting. Moving up to 282nd place, I have Let's Kill Hitler. I have a lot of issues with this story. The historical setting is used more or less exclusively for a gimmicky title and a few jokes at the beginning of the episode. The Tesselecta is a vigilante torture machine, the immorality of which never properly gets addressed. It's barely even important to the story. With a few rewrites, it could be removed entirely. But the worst thing about this story is how it handles the character of Mel's and River. The idea of a child being raised from birth to kill someone is a dark, heavy topic, and I do not think this story handled it well at all. First of all, neither Mel's nor River feels like someone who was raised in this abusive way. Instead, they feel more like reckless but sympathetic anti-heroes. Where the whole thing completely falls apart, though, is River's instantaneous change of heart. I love a good redemption arc, but I think they work best when the characters are shown to change incrementally over time. If the episode delved into how River overcame years of mental abuse, that could have made for an incredibly powerful and poignant story arc. But instead, we simply see her change her mind on a whim. Also, for a couple who's literally had their baby kidnapped, Amy and Rory have an awfully low level of alarm. Sure, they show some concern, but it's more reminiscent of concern for one's missing pet gerbil, not one's child. There's really nothing I like about this story. Moving up to 281st place, it's Dark Water and Death in Heaven. Peter Capaldi and Michelle Gomez are both fantastic in this two-parter, but their performances are pretty much the only two things I like about it. One of my major issues with this story is its lackluster use of the Cybermen. The idea of the Cybermen being able to convert organic matter into fully grown Cybermen, metal and all, is, at least for me, an unwelcome change from the previous conversion processes. To me, Cybermen are at their scariest when they use a slow, grueling process, such as the one we see in the Age of Steel. The scene where the flying Cybermen attack the plane feels eerily similar to the opening scene from Sharknado 2, and with all due respect to that film, it isn't exactly something a television drama should strive to emulate. Also, it seems that, in the case of Danny and the Brig, their emotional inhibitors were switched off purely for the sake of the plot. Ultimately, the Cybermen are simply used as a plot device, and are not even a true antagonist. Moving on from the Cybermen, this story's handling of Clara is quite terrible as well. Her attempted destruction of the TARDIS keys was borderline sociopathic, and wasn't something the Doctor should have forgiven so easily, regardless of how much he cares for her. Perhaps that scene, and many other scenes relating to Clara and Danny's relationship, would have made a bigger impact if their relationship had been written better throughout the series, but at least for me, all of those scenes fall flat. Speaking of writing throughout the series, it seems as though the whole Doctor hates soldiers thing was created solely for that one scene in the graveyard, and the whole Danny accidentally killed a child thing existed solely for that one scene at the end. Meanwhile, while Michelle Gomez is perfectly cast as Missy, her role in this story is very disappointing. The idea of a master redemption arc is incredibly intriguing, but I hate that it basically just came out of nowhere. It would have been far more interesting to actually see what caused Missy to decide she wanted to change. Also, the whole "don't cremate me" stuff is perhaps the darkest thing the show has ever delved into, and seeing as it doesn't even amount to very much, one wonders why it was included in the first place. Sadly, one of the few scenes in this story that I really do like, the perfect goodbye between the Doctor and Clara at the end, is ultimately nullified by subsequent episodes. Moving up to stories that I gave a 3 out of 10, in 280th place, it's the 7th Doctor's introduction story, Time and the Rani. Apart from the travesty of a regeneration scene, there isn't really one major thing about this story that makes it bad. It's just incredibly generic, predictable, boring, and has a plethora of small issues. Kate O'Mara is quite good again as the Rani, but the character doesn't really quite get used to her potential. There are also some significant plot holes. For example, why did the Rani need all of these Earth scientists when she herself considered them primitives? Surely a Time Lord like her would know anything that 20th century Earth scientists possibly could. Another issue with this story is that Mel's screaming is even more excessive than normal. On the positive side, Sylvester McCoy does deliver a solid performance in his introductory serial, with the post-regeneration trauma thankfully toned down. It's just a shame he didn't get to start with a better story. Moving into 279th, I have Fear Her. This story follows a remarkably similar pattern to The Idiot's Lantern. The Doctor and Rose visit a notable moment in London's history, they find out people are going missing, they investigate, one of them also goes missing, and the other one saves the day. That being said, there are a few things about Fear Her that make me prefer it to The Idiot's Lantern. The antagonist, a lost cosmic child, is a decently interesting concept. Also, I admire the story's attempt to deal with children's real-life issues, such as loneliness and abuse. However, this story has major flaws. For one, the level of alarm regarding the missing children seems remarkably low. But more significantly, the conflict resolution is ridiculous. Rose throwing a stone into the Olympic torch, a girl and her mother singing. It doesn't get much sillier than that. It's also bizarre how quickly Rose seems to come to the conclusion that the Doctor is dead. In the Satan Pit, he drops down a bottomless pit into the center of a planet potentially inhabited by the devil himself, and she still fully believes he's alive. In this story, she doesn't see him for the first 2 minutes after everybody returns, and she concludes that he's gone. While many mocked it, I do kind of enjoy the scene of the Doctor lighting the Olympic torch, cheesy as it may be. Overall, I don't think the story is quite as bad as some people say, but it's still pretty bad. In 278th place, it's the first 4th Doctor entry on the list, Meglos. This is a dull and lazy story. The political strife between the Tygellans was unoriginal and ultimately not necessary to the story, although it was fun to see Jacqueline Hill back. Meglos himself was quite a boring villain, despite being played by Tom Baker, and what looked like some crew member's houseplant. I mean, they literally just used a cactus to portray Meglos. Not a cactus-like alien, an actual cactus. And the climax was just a standard flips and switches scene, and that was about it. All in all, a very forgettable story. Moving up to 277th, I have In the Forest of the Night. Much like Fear Her, while I don't hate this story as much as most people, I still think it's pretty bad. On the positive side, it does look pretty good and has a unique premise. However, the bulk of the story is little more than the characters walking around the forest. Also, they have very little impact on the resolution. Sure, they tell everyone not to cut down the plant growth, but there's no way that humans were going to have enough time to destroy a significant portion of the forest anyway. The scene where Clara and the Doctor talk about whether or not to save people, knowing the rest of the planet and the people will die, could have been legendary had it been placed in a story like The Stolen Earth or The Pandorica Opens, but in this small, feeble story, it simply did not feel earned. I also highly resent the Doctor's statement that everyone will just forget the event. I understand from an out-of-universe perspective the desire to try and explain why these global events are never mentioned again in the show, but if the writers couldn't come up with a good explanation, they shouldn't have brought up the topic in the first place. In 276th place, I have another Series 8 episode, The Caretaker. This story barely even feels like Doctor Who. The alien threat was completely underdeveloped and purely used as a plot device to explore the relationships between Clara, Danny, and the Doctor. Unfortunately, the story doesn't even do a good job of that. It continues the whole Doctor hates soldiers thing to a ridiculous degree, and while Clara and Danny are both played by fine actors, I personally find that their characters have zero chemistry. After several episodes showcasing their relationship, I still felt completely uninvested in it, even though I've been heavily invested in relationships that are only side elements in single stories, like the ones in Voyage of the Damned, Under the Lake, and The Woman Who Fell to Earth, just to name a few. There is one line in this story that I absolutely love. After the Doctor is introduced as the new caretaker and Clara confronts him, he says, "So you recognize me then?" Capaldi's delivery is just brilliant and it cracks me up every time. But beyond that, this just feels like a glorified episode of Class. To be honest, I've never actually seen Class, it's just what I imagine Class is like. Moving up to 275th, I have Victory of the Daleks. In my opinion, there had never been a truly bad Dalek story until this one. Sure, stories like The Chase and Destiny of the Daleks are not perfect, but they're at least decent in my book. This story, however, is not. While there are a handful of positives to this story, namely the set designs, Winston Churchill, and the Daleks serving tea, the core of this story is pretty weak. The rapidity with which the military prepares airplanes for spaceflight was ridiculous. Matt Smith, while not bad, is not nearly as good as he normally is. The fact that a bomb made by the freaking Daleks was able to be diffused by love was ludicrous. And lastly, the Paradigm Daleks are perhaps the worst creature redesign in the history of the show. But hey, I'll still take this story any day over Asylum of the Daleks. Now we move from a story that Mark Gatiss wrote to a story that Mark Gatiss acted in. In 274th place, it's The Lazarus Experiment. Despite a somewhat promising start, this is one of my least favorite stories of the Russell T Davies era. For most of its runtime, it basically consists of a monster chasing people around a building. When it comes to poorly designed Doctor Who monsters, if you adjust for budget and time period, the Lazarus creature is quite possibly on par with the Merca. The only real saving grace of this story is that there was no alien involved. At least that was a bit of a change. And the conversation between Lazarus and the Doctor in the church is decent, although I can't help but think the Doctor is a bit hypocritical for saying people shouldn't extend their life when he's lived for hundreds of years. The story is definitely the weak link in an otherwise stellar Series 3. Now for 273rd, I'm going to go with The King's Demons from the Peter Davison era. It's a shame I have to rate this story so low because the first episode is quite good, as it does a pretty nice job of developing its historical setting. However, starting with the Master once again voluntarily taking off his disguise purely for the sake of a cliffhanger, it goes downhill pretty quickly. His plan as a whole is lame and marks another uninspiring attempt to rule the universe. The story ultimately feels very rushed and comes down to the Doctor thinking better than the Master. Up into 272nd place, I'm going with The Power of Three. The story is funny at times, but the actual plot is nothing special. However, the story doesn't really get bad until the last 10 minutes or so. First of all, besides Rory and Brian, the Doctor leaves all the captured people on the ship to die, even though he had time to save them. Secondly, the resolution to the entire plot was basically him just pressing some buttons. Finally, Amy's monologues at the beginning and the end of this story are super cringy. And in 271st place, I'm going with The Mythmakers. Now, this is the first story I've talked about that has missing episodes, so I want to take a bit of time to explain how I went about watching these stories. Obviously, in the case of animated stories, I just watched the animations. For other missing episodes, I either watched the loose canon reconstructions or the animations on the YouTube channel Who Recons. Now onto the story itself. The bulk of the story isn't exactly bad, but at least for me, it doesn't quite have the same magic as some of the other pure historicals. It sort of feels like the TARDIS crew was just shoehorned into the Iliad. However, the real problems I have with this story all happen in the final 10 minutes or so. For starters, Vicky, a character from the future, decides to stay in a time with people she has almost nothing in common with, so she can be with a boy that she met a day or two ago. This is, in my opinion, the worst companion exit ever. I'm not opposed to characters leaving for love, but Susan and Joe, for example, not only knew their partners a lot more than Vicky did, but they were also settling into a far safer situation than Vicky. Joe because she stayed in her own time, and Susan because she stayed with a member of the victorious side of a war. Vicky, meanwhile, stays with someone who is on the losing side of an ancient war. The Doctor was also extremely irresponsible for letting her stay, as she wasn't even 18, and at the time, the Doctor couldn't properly pilot the TARDIS, so he would never be able to return for her. All of this especially frustrates me because outside of this story, Vicky is one of my favorite companions. We don't even get a goodbye scene between her and the Doctor. Meanwhile, the new companion Katarina received tragically little development throughout her first story and had absolutely no idea what was going on when she entered the TARDIS. In fact, she barely even knew Stephen or the Doctor. If this story had ended differently, it would likely rank at least 50 slots higher. Alright, that's going to do it for episode 2. Stay tuned for episode 3, where I'll cover stories ranking from 270th to 256th.